So I'm going to try to stay put. Normally I walk around, but I know we have that. So I'm John Baluka. I'm from St. Louis, and I've been a long-time developer. But most importantly, we're here to talk about really not just nopCommerce, but open source itself and really what it can do for you. nopCommerce is probably the most popular .NET-based solution out there. And a lot of people, when they come up to me and ask me about nopCommerce, or they're trying to say nopCommerce, they pronounce it nopCommerce, nopCommerce. It's very easy to until you actually say it a couple times, because I'm going to say it 100+ times, but until you say it, it will not stick. So ready? On the count of 3, everybody's going to say nopCommerce. 1, 2, 3. Once you say it once, it'll stick on your tongue. So we're going to basically walk through this architecture. So this is actually mostly a technical talk. But the one takeaway hopefully you get from this is really understanding what the value of open source is for you as a developer and how it kind of applies to you, having a normal day job and how you can kind of incorporate that into your career. We'll get into those aspects. And also, what does it mean to be a full stack developer? I also noticed that when it comes to nopCommerce and kind of, how do I really kind of latch on to being this type of developer, being full stack? This is another aspect of nopCommerce that is worth considering. So let's look at this aspect of full stack development. Before I mention, actually, that I also coordinate speakers and sponsors for the St. Louis.NET Meetup. We meet the last Monday of the month typically. So yeah, we're on Meetup, just like the full stack Meetup is. And yeah, just go ahead and become a member. It's free. And we also do lightning talks along with the main talk. So if there's just like a short talk that you like to give, and it doesn't have to be .NET. We definitely do a lot of talks on Angular and things like that. So feel free to reach out to me, whether it's a main talk or a lightning talk. So when it comes to being a full stack developer, you see a lot of these programs where they're saying, you become a Java full stack developer, become a .NET full stack developer. And this is coming from the Claim Academy's website. And this is not a bad way to think of the stacks themselves, the .NET stack, the Java stack. But I start to look at different examples out there, and it starts to get kind of muddied when it comes to what is a full stack developer. It is front end, back end, databases, DevOps, I don't know. That's kind of the platform. I don't know how that really kind of fits in. There's mobile development. And then I see diagrams that kind of look like, I don't know what they're trying to communicate, but they're really trying to get more and more creative on what a full stack developer has to deal with. So you see more and more memes out there that are really kind of making things more confusing. And I did come across this to where there are 19 types of developers that were identified, and one of them is being a full stack developer. When it comes down to it, a full stack developer is more of a generalist developer that will dive deep into the front end at times. It'll dive deep into the mid-tier application side, like C# or Node, whatnot, or Java. The database aspect, the platform of AWS or Azure. That's what a full stack developer is. It's not like you're not tied to one particular technology all the time. You find yourself going in and out of different aspects of the entire stack throughout your career. That's the best way. And I think most of us are that. There's very few of us that are limited on the front end or limited in certain areas of development. I am finding more of that, but most developers out there, I think, consider themselves truly to be a full stack developer. So how do we better define this? And I really kind of look at the stacks being a little bit more defined and more driven by organizations. When it comes down to it, you do have companies like Microsoft driving their stack, as well as like you got Oracle, which used to be something driving their stack. You got Google driving their stack. So there's that motivation of an organization, but then you have the community itself that kind of has its own driven aspects across the different aspects of the stack. So where you got different languages and different engines that kind of basically power things, like on the desktop, where we've had WPF and WinForms on the Microsoft stack, JavaFX is on the Java stack. So yes, when it comes, it's really the different languages and platforms that are driven by these different companies or our community itself. Tools and guidance are also usually driven by those organizations. And then there's a culture and community around those. It's a good idea to pick a stack, especially if you're starting out. because then you can always translate from that stack and go into another stack on how it kind of compares. When it comes to learning in this industry, it's good to kind of keep going with what you know. That way it's easier to understand other stacks. You can draw those parallels. So like when it comes to mobile development, if I was a .NET developer, which I am, I would jump into Xamarin first. It'll make it a lot easier if I'm going to look at Flutter or Kotlin, which is kind of motivated within the Google stack. All right. So when it comes to being a full stack developer, there's really three things I kind of throw out. You want to choose a stack, and these don't have to be in a certain order, is that choose a stack. In this example, we're choosing Microsoft's .NET. Choose a learning platform. I choose Pluralsight. And throughout this whole presentation, I can't really, let's say, teach MVC or Entity Framework or things like that of .NET, but I can kind of refer you to other content where you can dive deeper into that. So as a full stack developer, you feel like you never know enough all the time. All developers feel that way anyway, but especially as a full stack developer, you feel that way. So I would highly recommend picking a learning platform, just like you pick Netflix or Hulu or one of those, and binge watch the heck out of it. We'll talk more about that. And then choose an open source solution. As we kind of go through this, hopefully see more of the value of why you want to choose an open source solution for your career and something that you refer to. All right, so again, I picked the .NET stack. I'm kind of moving forward with this. .NET itself, it's kind of cool that they're coming together in .NET 5 to be truly cross-platform across all devices. But overall, I really like being a Microsoft .NET developer. 10 years ago, not at all. I was ready to jump the .NET bandwagon because no one was happy when Windows 8 first came out. All the developers were getting ready to jump ship from .NET, and now it's kind of had a total 180 resurgence. I mean, they've open sourced so much, more than the other open source packages out there. C# is way more open source than Java even nowadays. So they did a 180, which is great. Yes. People want to think that. Actually, it's been in the works for many years. It's just they're a big ship and they're hard to turn, like any big company. But they had the right community within inside of it. So it was really a ground up kind of a resurgence of how all that came together. So yes, there's good things coming. If you want to get more of a history of .NET, I thought this was a really good presentation of a walkthrough. I've been working .NET since it first came out, but I thought this was a really good description of how everything kind of has played out over the years. And by the way, I throw a lot of content at you. If you want to copy these slides, send me an email. At the end, I'll even have my email on the last slide. But I throw a lot of content at you, and I would gladly share this whole slide deck. All right, so when it comes to picking a learning platform, there's a lot of choices out there. There's the different subscriptions like Pluralsight, LinkedIn Learning, even Codecademy. There's a bunch of other ones out there. You can do the a la carte route of like Udemy, which is really good and kind of cheap at times. There's a lot of good free stuff as well, whether it's on YouTube or Microsoft's Channel 9. Sometimes you would think the free stuff is good enough. In many ways, you can find some really quality stuff out there. For this, I kind of chose Pluralsight, and I do recommend actually choosing something like Pluralsight. The quality's there. They also got these different learning paths that are really good, that kind of get you on board with a certain technology, whatnot. And a couple of years ago, I kind of decided I'm going to watch a course a week on Pluralsight. So a couple of years later, I think I just crossed 200 completed courses. And so what's really cool, for a recruiter, you can share a little link like this up above, and it'll show all the courses that you have completed. So if you want to share what you're learning, this is another way to do it. That's why I say kind of commit to a platform. You really can't do this with YouTube or any of the free stuff. You can do it with the paid stuff, and it's quality. You can do the same thing with LinkedIn Learning too. And I'm finding for a lot of the content that we're needing as developers, I still find better quality here. It's not like I'm selling Pluralsight. I just watch it way too much. All right, so when it comes to open source solutions, you might think of like WordPress, but of course that's not in the .NET stack, but you might be thinking of, okay, I want to look at the PHP stack, and that's one of the, probably the most popular open source solutions out there. It's the most popular, actually, the largest majority of websites run WordPress. I can't remember the number, but it's It's pretty big. Magento is another open source solution that was actually bought by Adobe a couple years ago. Broadleaf on the Java space is an open source solution that's worth checking out as well. And the .NET space, there's a good handful of open source solutions I'm going to kind of briefly mention. And of course, I kind of chose nopCommerce to be the thing that I kind of look at and study. So nopCommerce itself, these pretty much go to their site, you can download for free. You can even see a live demo on their site, which is pretty cool too. I'll show some examples of that pretty soon. So the overall agenda for the night, we're just going to jump right into open source, what to look for, briefly touch on what nopCommerce is. Then this is going to be more of a technical talk. We're going to walk through the front end to the back end, even look at test coverage, and just highlight different aspects of this whole solution. And in summary, I'll share a few resources and where to get this presentation and whatnot. So this walkthrough, starting at 0, this talk used to be called Understanding nopCommerce from 0 to 60. Hence the 60. So we're going to be basically walking through the different projects of the solution. 0 means not so much that you know .NET or C#, but you're comfortable reading code, because you're going to look at a lot of it here pretty soon. But it is, if you have a .NET background, then yes, this is right up your alley. Nop.web is the storefront, the project within the solution. And then you got a shared framework or shared project there for the web, or the storefront and the administrator. Then there's a project for Nop Core, which is like that common library that has a lot of the shared code. Nop Services, this is where you'll find a lot of the business logic in here. And again, we're going to be looking at each one of these libraries. Nop Data, this is where a lot of the data access is and where Entity Framework is implemented. I haven't asked the question yet. How many people work with .NET? Very few? How many people have worked with .NET? All right. Okay, somewhat? All right, Entity Framework. That's usually kind of used a lot nowadays. You'll see how that's implemented in Nop Data. Look at the tests and how they're structured, as well as the plugin architecture, which is one thing I like about this solution. So one of the reasons, yes, I chose this solution because it is honestly your typical Microsoft stack solution. It's not because it's the greatest architecture out there. I was looking for something for my original purpose that really kind of fit the mold of being what a .NET developer would choose. Now this is kind of an architecture that you would have probably chosen before Angular was popular, let's just say that, because you notice we have really just jQuery and Razor View Engine. They're kind of trying to decide where do they want to take this. But right now on the front, it is really simple, but it's still a pretty quality and responsive experience on the site. But yes, it's .NET MVC using Entity Framework, SQL Server, and a handful of other libraries that we'll look into what their purpose is. So when it comes to working with this solution, you can actually get a lot of these tools for free. A lot of people aren't aware of this. But if you go to the Dev Essentials site, you can get the Visual Studio Community Edition. A lot of people aren't aware that is the Professional Edition. That is the same binaries as the Professional Edition. I had someone from Microsoft confirm that a few times. So you can even release commercial software under the Community Edition. It's like only if you make like, I don't know, a couple million a year, then you can't use the Community Edition. So the tooling is up to par now. You get some Azure credits, which is okay. Also, with Azure DevOps, with this, you get 5 users and unlimited private repositories. So where GitHub, you have to pay for private. Here, you get it for free. Although Microsoft just bought GitHub. What's that?
It changed recently.
Did they just change that? Okay, now you can't do unlimited private?
Bitbucket finally beat them down to where they'll give it away for free.
Oh, okay. Exactly. You also get a SQL Server Developer Edition, which is nice to really kind of test out some aspects of the database. And you also get a 3-month subscription to Pluralsight for free, as well as LinkedIn Learning and a few others. Highly recommend checking this out to get some free tools. All right, so let's jump right in open source. All right, when thinking of open source, I think of GitHub right away. That's still definitely the go-to place for a lot of the different repositories. We'll talk about that in a minute. When I was first looking at open source, I was looking at the different content management solutions, kind of like what WordPress is. So out there's like Embraco, Orchard, .NET Nuke. We'll touch on a couple of those. And then in the e-commerce space, there's nopCommerce, VertoCommerce, and SmartStore.net. So we'll touch on these briefly. So within GitHub, I find that not many developers go out there on a regular basis. And I highly recommend checking things out there, even kind of following different projects, because GitHub itself is just a big library of a bunch of end-to-end solutions that you could really learn a lot from. It's a lot better than a lot of your Hello World examples out there. You can see full-baked solutions, enterprise-level solutions out there to really kind of see how possibly you should architect your solutions. So definitely give GitHub a good look for different types of solutions you're looking for, like what's an enterprise-level solution that implements Angular? They're out there. It's worth finding an architecture that has that. So in the .NET space, .NET Nuke was one of the first ones that was kind of popular in the open source realm. They were originally VB.NET. They converted everything to C#, and they evolved quite a bit. They're still going pretty strong today. They're worth checking out. Umbraco, when it comes to the content management systems, is a very popular .NET-based solution as well. They have a really strong marketplace when it comes to developers trying to sell on top of the software. And yeah, it's worth checking out. There's another one out there called Orchard that's pretty cool, that they're kind of bleeding edge. So they're already at ASP.NET Core and some of the newer technologies. So you have to kind of pay attention to, are these open source solutions, they have a big market, but they're slowly growing, kind of like Umbraco, or are they like Orchard, where they kind of use Orchard almost like a prototype in a way to show what you can do with the latest and greatest. You kind of have to weigh the pros and cons when you look for a solution. So when I started looking for e-commerce solutions, I came across nopCommerce first. I wasn't totally happy with even though I really liked what I saw, I wanted to do a little more searching. And in doing that search, I came across VertoCommerce. Now this is a tech stack that, like on the front end, at least they're using AngularJS. I don't think they've switched to Angular yet, but they're at least using the AngularJS as well as Elasticsearch. So it's a really good reference architecture when it comes to that solution and how those technologies are implemented. And I also came across this solution called smartstore.net. Now this one looked really good. You know, the online demo, everything worked, and it just worked really nice. So I downloaded the source code, looking at the source code, and I'm like, man, this looks really familiar. Then I go to the nopCommerce source code. I find out there's a legal battle going on because basically smartstore.net basically just copied nopCommerce and put their name on it. They said they forked it. It's probably the biggest no-no you can do in open source, and they did that. So they did settle, their dispute, I guess you would say. But nonetheless, I saw that. That totally turned me off from smartstore.net, no matter how good that solution looked. And I went back to nopCommerce, and I really haven't looked really at much of anything else since for my purpose. All right, so moving on with Nop. On their site, you can basically see a front-end demo or the administration demo. You don't have to download the source code, compile it, and run it. You can just run the demo online. A lot of other open source solutions do this as well. And when it comes to looking at different solutions like GitHub, if you're not aware, you can just browse the source code, download the source code directly as a zip file. You can connect to it with a Git client or even an SVN client if you want to. What's that? Or you can fork it, yes. So like for nopCommerce and even a bunch of other solutions out there, they may not have as many, let's say, commits or contributors because they've only been on GitHub itself for, let's say, about 3-4 years, to where they were on codeplex.com, which was Microsoft's former open source repository. They shut down Codeplex and everybody moved everything to GitHub. And then Microsoft bought GitHub. So I think there was a plan when they shut down Codeplex to do something about GitHub. But yes, so there's some solutions out there that have been around for 10 years, like nopCommerce has, but they seem like they haven't been around as long because they just moved everything to GitHub. So be aware, they probably were in some other shared repository. Built with, how many people heard of this site? This site's really cool. You can put in technology like nopCommerce and you can see how it compares, well, first off, like what regions it's popular in. It's very popular in the States, how it compares to other similar solutions like Magento. Even shows like how many people are moving from one type of technology to another. So builtwith.com is awesome to do a search for technology. It's also very good when it comes to putting in a company's site. So whatever.com, and you want to see the tech stack behind that site, it does a really good job of telling you. So if you're getting ready to interview somewhere and you want to see, this looks like a .NET architecture, this looks like, something PHP or WordPress, you can put in that whatever companyname.com, and it does a really good job of giving you the results back pretty quick for free, what that tech stack is. So I use this anytime I'm ready to interview with a company. Right away, I put in that company site into this and see what they're using, at least for their main site. And there's other ways to discover these different solutions. Matter of fact, I really discovered nopCommerce and a few other solutions from this web platform installer. So in the .NET space, and when you install Visual Studio, they have this web platform installer that kind of gives you a nice curated list of the solutions out there, whether they're .NET or not. Matter of fact, like WordPress is in this list as well. So a lot of these solutions will eventually take you back to GitHub, but there are other better curated places out there that will give you lists of solutions to check out. All right, so the opportunities in nopCommerce are really any open source solution out there. When you first look at nopCommerce, you think, oh, there's a marketplace. You could sell plugins, like different customizations, or sell different themes as a developer, or even have some open source stuff. So that's kind of like the initial driver of how a developer could financially benefit from open source. Kind of like the obvious, I guess you'd say. There's a marketplace for around a lot of these different solutions. There's certifications. nopCommerce has their certification. Pay $100, take a test. I haven't done it yet, but you can do that and get certified in that particular software. So you're finding a lot more of these open source solutions that have been around a while. They have their certifications. You can apply it. You can be a store owner, set up a drop shipping site, or you can put some of your own downloadable content in there. So you could simply apply the software. Now this last point should be a big, bold point. This is really an architecture that you want to have when you're going into interviews. And here's my justification behind this. When it comes to interviews, I've been on both sides of the table many a times, being interviewed and doing the interviewer and interviewees. And this wasn't an original idea for me. Someone was kind of talking about an open source solution, how they were kind of communicating what they knew. But I have kind of, in retrospect, whenever someone would talk about, let's say, their current job, and they're kind of unknowingly giving away all these trade secrets during their interview, they don't realize how that just comes across as a bad thing. But that's their reference point, and you get that as an interviewer. You're okay. I understand. That's the only thing you can really talk about, that because that's all that you really have applied. That's all that you really looked at is what you've done on the job. As well as, or maybe through a coding school. You're only talking about what you did in the coding school. You're not really looking outside of what your day job is. And if you are doing something in open source and you're proud of it and you're doing your own project, that can come across as a negative. Because it comes across like you're wanting to implement that software into that company once you get hired. So you have to be careful about talking about your own stuff and how proud of you are of it. And it might come across like, he's going to want to implement his own ORM in our company. So there's this third option. Have a reference architecture, open source, that you can talk about. When you need to communicate and understand how you know what dependency injection is in whatever framework you're dealing with, or how, what an ORM is and data access, and what does a multi-tier architecture look like, find a reference architecture. You don't have to create it. Study it. Make it something that you can simply have a conversation about. This is really big on interviews now, that you can kind of talk tech without giving away any secrets and really communicating what you know. And you're not trying to sell them your own stuff either, that you're going to implement it. So hopefully the biggest takeaway is not so much to go out and nopCommerce, but find an architecture that's in your tech stack that you're currently dealing with right now and adopt it until you don't like that architecture anymore. But try to find that architecture that you can talk about with people. And it might even take you further. We'll get into that as well. All right, so nopCommerce, what is that? So it's really your typical shopping cart solution. When it comes to, you can even have multiple stores, handles a variety of payment methods through plugins, and you can customize it through all get out. Even has a blogging aspect to it. It's actually a pretty powerful solution. when you run the online demo, so out of the box, this is what it looks like. As you can see, it's responsive if you kind of size down the browser, so what it would look like on a mobile device. And the administrator as well, when it comes to managing a lot of different things, it's they do a pretty good job of the architecture and also responsive as well, to where if you have to scale it down. So even though they may not be using any certain framework on the front end, they do make, they sensibly use, let's say, jQuery and their style sheets when it comes to having a really quality experience for the user. All right, so that tech stack, you can see this splash of technologies, but when we walk through the architecture, it's going to help a lot to actually have them in some kind of like swim lanes, I guess you'd say, as we walk through the front end of the application layer, the business logic layer, and then the data access layer. And we'll be touching on these different technologies. So again, the project structure, I like it for a .NET solution. It's pretty simple and easy to follow. For an enterprise level solution. Also out of the box, it comes with a good handful of plugins. So when it comes to different payment methods and shipping methods, those are implemented as plugins. That way as a developer, you can actually add another shipping method or whatnot, payment method, by following that pattern. When you walk through this whole architecture, and if it makes sense, creating a plugin follows the same pattern as the architecture. That's what's kind of nice of when you understand the full solution. Creating a plugin makes it a lot easier. Some people jump into wanting to create a plugin for whether it's nopCommerce or something else without really understanding how the main software works. And that's why it's very important, whether it's nopCommerce or something else, understand how the main software works. That way when you try to extend it, it'll make a lot more sense. All right, so we'll keep these different technologies in mind as we kind of walk through these different projects. But the projects kind of fall under these different swim lanes as well. So when we look at the application layer, we'll touch on the storefront, nop.web, and admin, as well as the business layer and data access layer. Now, not every solution is perfect. So when it comes to how things are referenced to each other, it looks a little more cluttered than what it is, or maybe it might look a little more messy. For example, nop.data only is really used for hitting SQL Server data. When it comes to other data for caching data that comes from core. So some people might look at this architecture and say, well, it's not perfect. No architecture is going to be perfect, but it's pretty doggone close when it comes to having something that has the separation of concerns and things of that nature to be something worth using as a reference architecture. So no architecture is perfect, but it's a pretty good enterprise level app. All right, so different entry points. We're going to go through those first, the storefront and the administrator. And think of it this way. So let's say you just got hired on to work on a nopCommerce project, and you have about 40 minutes of my time, and I got to walk through the architecture with you to get you up and running. That's kind of how I kind of position this talk. So I'm not really trying to show you the most cool parts of nopCommerce. I'm trying to show you the most consistent parts of the software. That way you get a good feel on how the front end works, how the business logic is managed, as well as how the data access is handled. So that's how this talk is kind of designed. I'm not so much trying to teach MVC or Entity Framework or even .NET itself, but it's a matter of you got 40 minutes of my time, I get to show you nopCommerce, then you're off and running to do what you can with it. All right, so we're going to look at nop.web, nop.admin. When it comes to that storefront, by making nop.web your startup, you would basically fire right up to that storefront. What's kind of nice as a developer, first time you run the app, if it can't find where the database is located, it kind of has this almost not step by step, but basically it prompts you where do you want to install the database. This is some people may not like this, but I kind of like it. So when you first run the app, it asks you where do you want to put it. You basically specify the server name, credentials, and all that, and it'll create the database for you, most likely on your local SQL server. For a .NET developer, the connection information of the database is in a weird spot for the 3.9 version. Since they moved to ASP.NET Core, they now store it in a more common location. So this is just a good reference if you actually want to look at where the connection is stored. But it is nice, again, that when you first fire up the app, it'll prompt you for where do you want to put the database, or where do you want to reference the database. All right, so when you're walking through an architecture, you might want to think, okay, I'm going to go to the home page, and maybe I see how we got these different sections of the home page, how they're kind of, it's like a dashboard, you know. And then you look at the code behind this home page, and you find, well, okay, I see how it's something that kind of gives me like, this is a widget, and this is this thing called a topic. Not a good place to start in walking through the architecture. So we're going to start on a more simple page, let's say like the registration page, to where we're going to get a good flow of what the data, how the data flows through the system. So on the registration page, you kind of put in some info and submit that data. So when it comes to looking at a .NET architecture, I typically work from looking at the controller, then I'll look at the model, then I'll look at the view when it comes to an MVC architecture. So the controller, and looking at that registration page, it returns this action result. And that action result method returns the view. It's getting a model passed to it that was created within that method. So if you're a .NET developer, you're looking at this, and I would kind of confirm that there's nothing crazy here. This is typical .NET MVC coding pattern that you would see. It's where the controller has this action result method. It's going to instantiate that model and pass it on to the view and return the view, which is that content, that page. Now, a couple of things that nopCommerce did a little different is how they handle multiple languages as well as validation. So on the model itself, nopCommerce has it to where, let's say on the last name, they had this key kind of value that's utilized for looking up for that particular language what to display. So when it comes to account field's last name, you want to see last space name for English. That's basically the key that's used to look up the language. So if we go to what it looks like on the view side for last name, we see when it comes out of ASP4, it'll work behind the scenes and show the correct language. Now, there's also this aspect now in ASP.NET Core where you can do tag helpers. So when it comes to a standard on tag helpers where we have this not required, where you can create these custom tags, in this example, if there's no value entered in for last name that it's required, it'll show the little red asterisk. So this is kind of getting to a level of .NET that's kind of intermediate, where things are a little different in nopCommerce, and I think there's a good standard here on how they implemented tag helpers for this type of razor syntax. So in creating that tag helper behind the scenes, you have this nop-required in this element, or I'm sorry, in that attribute for the class itself that kind of draws that link to the markup. And what it returns is a span with that little asterisk. That is what gets set on the UI. So when it comes to creating a tag helper in .NET, ASP.NET Core, it's a good example, and there's a bunch of other examples in this architecture that do this as well. Validation. So when it comes to I guess you'd say a consistent approach for validation, they use this Fluent validation library to make that, well, we'll look at the examples here, but normally validation is kind of handled within your model. This kind of puts it in one place. Let's take a look at this. So here we have our register model, so the model behind that page. And we have this, by using the Fluent validations attributes, we can have this attribute of this validator. We're passing this other class to it called this register validator. So we're kind of basically binding that validator to the model itself. If we look closer at that register validator, and we notice there's even like almost like a two-way binding going on there for the register validator being aware that it works with the type of register model. We had this, some people like this, some people don't, but you had this Fluent type syntax and then this line of code here that, in my opinion, does look kind of ugly. But you have this one line of code here that gives you the message of the last name is required. That's what this one line of code is telling us. But this Fluent syntax is becoming a lot more popular, not only in the .NET stack, but even in other stacks as well, JavaScript stack, and when it comes to working with lambdas and things like that, this is a very popular syntax that's growing. So what I like about this validator is that you can actually pass data to the class of the validator, which means the validator itself can be testable. You can actually write unit tests around this class that does validations. So when it comes to getting that more intermediate advanced on the value of this, I think that's where you start to really find the value of working with a library like this within a .NET architecture. All right, so the administrator, it's actually part of the web app itself, but they have it as a separate project also. It's a very kind of typical kind of navigation, I think, when it comes to, you got navigation on the left-hand side, you got a search area, and then you have the grid below. What I found valuable when it comes to as a reference architecture looking at nopCommerce is that that grid below uses a common library called datatables.net. They actually just implemented this in the current version, which is version 4.2. Prior to that open source library for managing grids, they were using Kendo UI, the community edition of that. So when it comes to having a good architecture on how Kendo UI is implemented, you know, rather than the hello world examples that you see out there, as well as datatables.net, it's a really good solution for that. And to kind of wrap up the front end here, I really wrap up entry points. This is what I found very interesting about nopCommerce and how powerful it really is that Web API is really a separate thing within .NET, separate library. That's not part of the solution itself. So here a vendor, Nop Templates, implemented web APIs to where they wanted to be able to have people maybe like do an API call of get products. So they don't have to use the interface, they can just do this API call using the web API interface and get all the products. Well, they did that via a plugin. So what's cool about this is that a plugin doesn't require you to recompile the overall architecture itself. You basically create a plugin, and you can also incorporate other libraries like Web API, and all of a sudden you have Web API implemented in this full solution without even touching the source code of the original solution. So you can add on some pretty big features. A lot of people, when it comes to full text searching and adding Elasticsearch and some of these other search engines, you can do that through the plugin architecture. You don't have to touch the source code or even look at it. You just install it as a plugin. You write your component, put it in the marketplace, and they install it as a plugin. So that community and that workflow for this solution, I've seen this in others, it's really powerful for how you can implement some pretty big features within the existing architecture without being part of the solution through this plugin model. So nopCommerce itself, they're not on the bleeding edge, but they're like, when it comes to the .NET ecosystem and, you know, are they doing things too fast, too slow? It feels like they're doing things just right. So when they very first started out, they were using ASP.NET Web Forms. They converted everything over the MVC to their 2.0 version. The 3.9 version, which is really only about 3 or 4 years old, seems like every year they're having a big or a release. Matter of fact, I'm expecting that they're going to be releasing a 4.3 or something version before the end of this week, because the nopCommerce annual conference is taking place tomorrow, actually. So there will be an announcement and probably a release as well. But nonetheless, from 3.9 to 4.0, that's when they prepared for .NET Core. They basically they implemented the updated Razor syntax or tag helper syntax, and they got ready for .NET Core. From 4.0 to 4.1, they now compile directly to .NET Core. And then from 4.1 to 4.2, now they can run on Linux and also run within a Docker container. So they're not bleeding edge, but they're right there where they need to be in order to kind of show that they're, you know, really keeping up with things. So again, this is what you also want to look for in an open source solution, that they're not falling way behind on the tech stack side of things, that they're not still doing web forms or something like that, that they are maybe a year or two after something gets released. Not even that long nowadays, maybe 6 months to a year that they're implementing it then. And what's nice is that over time, an architecture like this, you can learn from as well. So when it comes to like how you did things, in the past with the Razor syntax, it looks a little, from the homepage perspective, it looks a little better, I think the old way. But the newer way, it looks more like your normal markup, to where the traditional Razor syntax on how you would create a Razor page in .NET looks like what you do on the left. It doesn't look HTML friendly. It's the best way of saying it. To where nowadays, the newer syntax looks HTML friendly, looks like HTML, looks like a proper markup. So you can kind of really learn from what a solution will look like when you implement it. You know, how much of a difference, you know, what will it look like at a larger scale? And you can kind of see that looking at one version to another for nopCommerce itself. All right, so I'm going to, as I kind of mentioned different Pluralsight courses, that kind of gives a sense I'm going on to the next section. So on the UI side, ASP.NET Core Tag Helpers, that's a really good one to dig in deeper. Also, this is a really good course on a deep dive on ASP.NET Core on the Razor side. All right, business logic. So this is where we're going to move into the NOP services and NOP Core a little bit more. Before we do that, a little bit of recap. We got the controller that basically instantiated the model. It also returned a view, and it had a model passed to the view itself. So the controller has to get its data from somewhere, and it's going to work with something called a service, a factory, something that's going to go have the business logic and go get more data somehow, some way. Now this is not an architecture that's unique to the .NET platform. This is, if you look at Java architectures, even when you think of like what do you do on the client side with a JavaScript architecture and where does Node fall in and all these other aspects, they fall in a similar swim lane type aspect when you really break up code. So that controller is going to go through a service of some kind that's going to have a lot of business logic. That service is going to populate what's called the domain entity, and that will fill in the model on the UI side. So the separation of concerns, you hear this a lot in architecture, is really well done in nopCommerce. You know, the UI can't really hit the database directly. It has its proper layers. All right, so you got dependency injection and version control. And within nopCommerce, it's implemented pretty well. Dependency injection, we're really just going to be passing the data we need to the constructor of the class. And in version of control really comes down to being a framework. AutoFact is the library for that. So I'm not going to show any more words and diagrams. We're just going to jump right and look into some code to really hopefully make this point clear. So when it comes to the customer controller, and that customer controller has all these different things that it's going to go get data from. So that customer controller looks like it's going to work with an order service to go get data. But yeah, there's 30 some odd things that are going to go get data for us. In the example earlier on the registration page, to fill in that registration model, it did something to prepare that registration page, some kind of data access or data preparation. So that method came off of that second thing that gets passed to that customer controller. And most of these are interfaces that are getting passed. They're not actual, classes themselves. They're interfaces that you would pass an instance of a class to. All right, so why do we do this? Developers, no matter the architecture now, .NET, Java, JavaScript, why do we make things so doggone hard nowadays? Take a guess. Yeah. So when it comes, comes down to the unit testing. So when we're expected to put unit tests around everything, and a unit test is when you're truly controlling the data. There's no data connections getting made inside of the controller or other classes. We need to pass that data to these classes that are managing business logic, and then for how it gets its data, it's not making the connection with inside. Therefore, you could write a unit test. This may not necessarily be a good example, but this came from the nopCommerce code, where you can mock repositories, where you can kind of query data. And so for that customer service class, you can mock that and try to get the result that you want. So the reason we do all this nowadays, when it comes to dependency injection and having an IOC container version control, it's all because of unit testing, which is a good thing because these architectures are getting bigger and bigger. So we have to think of ways on how can we control the data going into that business logic so we can write this little unit test to make sure I didn't break anything and run those tests every time I check in code. So that's why we're making things so hard nowadays. It wasn't this hard in the 90s. Not saying our code was prettier, but it wasn't this hard in the 90s. But it's good that this is pretty much, it is kind of the standard nowadays. All right, so you want to be able to control that data going into your business logic so you can test that logic outside of the application. So that customer controller, here we have this, one of the first thing, this address model factory. So for what that class is going to go do for us, what kind of data access things it's going to do for us, sounds like it's going to be a pretty simple class. Like it might, I don't know, format an address or go query a couple tables for us maybe. I'm not sure what it does. So I thought I would kind of take that one step further, and then within the customer controller itself, I went ahead and added a constructor that has no parameters. And so basically I wanted to instantiate in line all these different classes. So just the address model factory itself, I put the dependencies of the dependencies of what that would look like. So again, this code is not in nopCommerce, but if I actually wanted to instantiate that one class by itself, everywhere it's read, by the way, is where you see a database connection, a connection string. I got to go get that data. So for whatever reason, it has these dependencies. There's like 300 some odd child dependencies just on that one thing that we thought was going to be really simple for what it was going to do. And I didn't try to do the other ones. I just want to get to a full compile. And that's why you need a version control. You need a container. You need a framework around dependency injection. Because things can get out of hand very fast. That dealing with the dependencies of the dependencies, you need something that can just manage that chaos, that if you're going to try to handle it manually. So AutoFact is an example of one of those. It is now actually dependency. There is a container built into ASP.NET Core, but prior to that, AutoFact was one of the popular containers out there. So what that looks like, in nopCommerce, they had a pattern put in place to where if you create this dependency register class, and I did a search across the solution for that class, and as an example here, we have this container builder that gets passed to this register method, which is an AutoFact container. Now, that address model factory, not so much really diving deep into what that syntax means, whatnot, but this one line of code prevented the worry about those dependencies of dependencies. Does this class have everything it needs? Well, if this application breaks when it tries to add that, it tries to execute this line, then it doesn't have everything it needs. And that's good. At runtime, it tells us that whenever this class will get called, get instantiated, it has everything it needs. Otherwise, you got to worry about all those dependencies when you go down this path of dependency injection. So again, controlling your data through dependency injection is the expected pattern nowadays in a lot of the code we write. But when it comes to how you manage that over time, it can get really ugly. So yes, one line of code will handle that now for each of these classes. So there's the first example is kind of complicated. It's kind of like there's a criteria way you can add these dependencies. Most commonly, you can do it by a given type of, so like what we saw at the address model factory. All the controllers, anything that has a base type of controller, just register those. Make sure they're going to work for us before the application really runs. So again, these are all kind of added to the AutoFact container at startup and kind of verify everything's going to work for us. When it comes to data access and making sure those connections to the database are going to work for us, this is most commonly how a container is really used. All right, so AutoMapper. So I know not many work with .NET, but AutoMapper is a popular library that makes it easier to, if you're trying to set another object, and let's say you got this object that has a property called last name, and this other object has a property called last name, how you can just kind of map those really easy. Well, AutoMapper is a library that does that for us. And what I liked about this is that when it comes to the .NET developer perspective, I liked how they used extension methods to make it easy to just kind of fill in that domain entity into the model on the UI. So here we have this one-line method that's kind of going to take that manufacturer entity and populate it into the manufacturer model. And even though AutoMapper itself is a one-liner, it's kind of nice how this is contained in here. Now this is the way it was in the version 3.9 code when I first pulled all this presentation together. And I'll kind of show you how some things changed and even kind of got better. So manufacturer controller, what that'll do is it'll get the manufacturer, populate all the data in that manufacturer entity, and here we have this one-liner being used, the manufacturer to model getting filled into the model itself. So we're not worried about, last name, first name, all these different individual properties. We can do it with one line of code using the library of AutoMapper. So that was the 3.9 version of the code, and I was looking at the recent version of the code, and I noticed it's changed just slightly. In which they now have this prepare manufacturer model method off this factory. So I thought I'd dig a little deeper in what that really does now. So inside of that particular method, there is now a to model that's now using generics within .NET, which is kind of nice. So it looks like they even streamlined it even further to where AutoMapper now just uses generics and a lot more code was reduced. So this is another thing to look for in how are they evolving over time on cleaning up their code, making it more efficient over time. This is one example in nopCommerce on how they didn't have to do all this. Actually, I thought I was fine with the way the code was in 3.9, but they did refine it and make it better. Might have been an outside contributor that did this, I'm not sure, but little things like this, I find in this architecture, they continue to evolve. And that's another thing, again, to look for different solutions. All right, so got the service, populates the domain entity, and that fills in the model itself. I haven't really looked at any business logic yet, so when it comes to like deleting a customer, that's logic to where when you delete a customer in nopCommerce, it doesn't really delete the customer. It will actually just mark them for deletion. You see this in a lot of solutions where they don't actually delete the record. They'll just mark a flag, deleted or is deleted. And that's what they do here, set it to true, and then just update the customer. So in a way, that's business logic. You're not deleting it. You're kind of handling it a little different. And for what gets passed to this method, delete customer, is the customer domain entity. And what I like about this architecture is that the customer entity is really simple. There's no extra business logic inside here on the entities. So how they managed business logic versus data, the domains, they kept it really clean and straightforward on where you'd find the logic. All right, so you could dig further into different IOC containers out on this course. And now ASP.NET Core has its own dependency injection, which is pretty cool. It's worth checking out. Matter of fact, at the end of this particular course, they even talk about how you can implement your own custom container. And the example they use is AutoFact. So it's kind of nice how they kind of pulled that together for me on the value of having AutoFact even today. All right, data access. Now, I thought I knew data access pretty well and entity framework pretty well. And even looking at this solution, I haven't seen entity framework even implemented this way before. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I'll kind of go ahead and share it with you. Now, the database itself is pretty straightforward. That's what I liked about the solution. There's no crazy database structure. It's pretty easy to follow the actual tables, whatnot, that are laid out in the SQL Server. And they were using Entity Framework 6, and now they moved everything over to Entity Framework Core. So again, everything runs under .NET Core and even runs cross-platform. All right, so this architecture, that service is going to get its data through a repository type class, which is a common pattern. And that repository is going to work with something called a domain mapper that will then fill in the domain entities as it pulls back data. So when it comes to data being in memory, it's only in the domain entity or the model. When it comes to data being in memory, it's not getting loaded up a third time. So the performance is decent. So in the customer service class, this is in the business layer, we have this method get customer by ID. And we have this customer repository. This is a very common aspect of .NET that you would see. So when it comes to, if you're being new to .NET architectures, this flow of how you work with a repository pattern and where that customer repository is actually an I repository of type customer. This is a very common pattern on how .NET code is today. And then this method of get by ID, works based upon how that interface is implemented. All right, so that interface has aspects of get by ID, insert, update, all those different operations against a database that you would expect to find is what you would find on this iRepository interface. This iRepository interface is implemented by EF repository, Entity Framework Repository. There could be one for nHibernate or Dapper or any other ORM that's out there, but here we're implementing it for Entity Framework. And this, I think, is kind of funny. So when it comes to how you get something by ID, in the source code, they have this comment of why they implemented things the way they did. So you find things like this in open source quite a bit. But yeah, it's just doing a simple entities.find for how it's implementing that get by ID. So this is where things were kind of new for me on how Entity Framework was used in the solution. I've used Entity Framework quite a bit, to where I saw this table property that's off this EF repository of this type iQueryable, and then which actually just kind of points you right to this entities property. So when I looked at that, I was kind of curious, why is that actually even there? And here we are back in an example within the customer service class. We have this class getCustomer by GUID, and what we're doing here is really the link syntax, but it's a link to objects, meaning that it doesn't really know about Entity Framework. It's just working with an interface. And you can do these kind of cool queries in .NET where you can do link to objects. So what's happening is that this link to objects query is getting projected to Entity Framework to then handle the ORM aspect of getting data from the SQL Server. So in theory, you don't have to use Entity Framework. You could use nHibernate or something else that implements this interface. It also implies that you can put logic like this in the business layer. You can do a query in the business layer. A lot of your DBAs don't like it when you do that. So when I show this, when I do present this to a lot of .NET developers, I find that very few have seen this syntax. Matter of fact, it's usually someone that's just come out of college. It's interesting that I hear that some professors actually teach Entity Framework this way. It's kind of blew me away because it's a pretty advanced level of working with Entity Framework. But again, it's cool that you can actually do these kinds of queries in the business layer, but again, if you have DBAs and you're working with a large organization, it may not be a cool thing to do. They may not want you to do things this way. But for simple queries, it's not so bad. So this was new to me. I discovered this way of doing things with Entity Framework by reviewing this architecture. All right, so this domain mapper, to kind of wrap things up here. This customer map class, and that is what actually tacks on the metadata of like how long a field can be onto your model. So a lot of times you'll actually, when you look at the hello world type examples, you'll see this metadata on the models themselves or on the domain entities themselves. And here it's kind of abstracted to where it's in this one mapping type class to tack on, like for system name, it's 400 characters long. So this data that's, like this is the size that it is in the database and other dependencies. It's handled through this mapping class instead of what you find in a lot of the hello world examples of how you put this data on the domains as attributes. And this is not a nopCommerce thing, even though it inherits from nop entity type configuration. It's actually an entity framework feature that allows you to do this fluent syntax. So I keep using the word fluent syntax, where on the front end you had this fluent validation, and here you have this fluent approach of doing mapping of data. I find this, again, very common in not only the .NET stack, but in the JavaScript stack, when it comes to having this Lambda type fluent way of dealing with your statements, I guess you'd say is the best way of saying it. So working with a Lambda expression, whatnot, is becoming more and more common use. All right, wrapping up the data. When it comes to handling image files, it does things in the file system as well as the database. The configuration management is pretty intense. The cloud solution, there's a lot of things they prepared for in Azure. And how many people have heard of Redis? It's a caching solution. What I've kind of discovered in looking at this architecture is how simple it was to implement Redis in your solution. Only was a few lines of code, and all of a sudden they got these performance gains from using Redis. So,
Are they doing anything crazy with Redis?
no, and that's what kind of blew me away. It's like it was and I'm sure other people they had their needs, and they probably had to extend their implementation of how they use Redis because of the high volume that Redis kind of can handle for you. But yeah, I was impressed on how few lines of code it was to implement that solution and then get the performance gains of that platform of Redis. All right. So NA Framework in the Enterprise, I thought this was a really good course to kind of follow the patterns that are inside of there. All right, last, test coverage. Now this is kind of entertaining. You'll be kind of surprised to see what you're about to witness. First off, I think it's really good to get on the same page of what testing is. You have functional tests. That's your UI test. You're typically using something like Selenium to hit those web pages. Test Stack is for a .NET developer. It's an awesome solution that uses Selenium under the covers on testing web apps. They have a really good structure on how they manage page models, but they also can Test Stack, which is a free open source, can also hit desktop apps like WinForms and WPF apps. So functional testing, Selenium is kind of like the standard on web apps, but when it comes to other types of apps, Test Stack is pretty cool. All right, integration testing. This is when you're actually hitting data. So you're hitting a database, you're hitting a web service, you're accessing files, you're hitting a system resource. If you're putting in your code some kind of datetime.now in your code and you're not injecting that, you cannot unit test that because that's data that you cannot control. So when it comes to data, you have to and get to a point of unit testing. That's where you're truly controlling any aspect of the data of that function, of that logic, of those if statements and so on that you're trying to deal with here. So nopCommerce itself is pretty much all unit test for what's inside the solution. But it's really good to have these three different types of testing in mind because all of our managers are saying we need to increase our unit test. Unless your architecture looks like what nopCommerce is, where you can do dependency injection and things like that, you can't do unit testing. You actually have to tell your manager, I can't do unit test. So why can't you do unit test? And I was able to show him nopCommerce. And I says, our architecture doesn't look like this. And it, boom, made my point. Have a reference architecture to help prove your point of why you need to get to something that is unit testable. Because it's really hard to kind of have these examples to help justify your case. And I was able to, fortunately, for this particular project, show this architecture when it comes to trying to get there. And I'm sure you'll find something in your own stack. All right, so a unit test, they're using NUnit. Nothing too crazy inside of here. You have a lot of different repositories that are going to get mocked up inside of a unit test. And there's this setup method. So when I was looking at the different unit tests, nothing too crazy here. I noticed that they made use of test extensions. So normally in a .NET test, you would see an assert here as your last line for a unit test. But they kind of implemented some test extensions to where they kind of controlled that a little more. So what I kind of got from this is that not many companies I see put really good patterns or reusable code inside of their unit test. They're just kind of creating unit tests and kind of doing their own patterns without thinking that, they are writing new code. There are some common libraries they could kind of utilize as well within the unit test. So this is how that is being utilized through test extensions is a good example on how that could be done within a .NET app. .NET app. To get the coverage, I had to install this adapter. So if you really want to see the same coverage, you'd have to do the same within Studio. But this is what kind of surprised me. This is a solution. I think right now, there's like 50,000 active sites. At the time of this version, this was the 3.9 version I got the coverage from, they were probably at around 30,000 active sites. So actually, just in a couple of years, they almost doubled their number of active sites. Still, they get millions of downloads and things like that. A lot of people look and work with this software. So I just ran all the unit tests. I want to just run everything. And what do you notice when you look at the left-hand side of the screen? There's a lot of red in there. There's a lot of failed tests. So when I just run all the tests, it's a small number, but this is the the 3.9 version production release. So this isn't right off Dev Branch or anything like that. This is the 3.9 version published release. And out of the box, there's this failed number of tests. I was surprised to see this. But then you start to learn more, when it comes to getting involved in open source. So let's say there is a solution that you really do like. This is where they need the most help, is writing some of their tests, some of their test coverage. Taking this a little bit further, looking at the coverage of the overall solution, I see it's only 20% covered of the entire solution. Kind of surprised by that, and I thought, okay, let's look at a library like the nop services where there's a lot of business logic. That's where we should have some higher numbers, and that's where we see we just have 9%. What if we look at that customer service class we've been looking at through most of the demo? That's at 4%. But here, we have this beacon of hope here where we see a method here with 96% coverage. When we take a close look at the method there and its code coverage, really the only thing you can test is that if statement. And what you notice by the code coverage, by running all the unit tests, that shows us that that if statement was never tested. There's really nothing else to test in there, and that thing says it's 96% covered. So what I kind of got out of this is that, of course, low numbers are bad. They're not good. Something like 20%, you want to have higher, of course. However, unless something's at 100%, 96% is a false positive. This isn't covered. There's one condition here that's not being checked, and that says it's 96%. Now, it might get you under the radar with your manager in a ways, hey, got that at 96, but again, it's either at 100% for a given method or it's not tested. That's the best way of looking at it. That's what I really kind of taken away from looking at the test coverage of this overall solution, is that you don't want to get, low numbers are bad, but don't get fooled by the high numbers. They have to be at 100% per method. When it comes to going through the different aspects of automated testing, functional integration unit, I thought this was a really good course, Pluralsight, and Test Stack. Again, that's a really good open source library. There's a really good course out on Pluralsight about that too. All right, I'm going to go through extensibility pretty quick and wrap this up. So on the extensibility side, when it comes to what you can do with nopCommerce, there's over 1,000 shops that they showcase. So when it comes to how you can really make things look quite a bit different, there's a lot of examples out there that you can check out when it comes to the theming side of things. And you can even kind of go through the sites and see how they implemented other aspects of like search and whatnot. Within the solution, like I said, they give you a handful of plugins. They have a whole bunch more out on GitHub, like nopCommerce has a bunch more on GitHub, and then they have their marketplace itself where you would find a lot of free ones as well. With inside of here, they have some that are, let's say, more UI, so that on the homepage where you got the carousel, that's actually a plugin. It's called this Nevo Slider. And then you have other plugins that do a little bit more. So what's kind of cool is that you can create a plugin that can also, on installation, create a table in the database through entity framework migrations. So your plugin can do quite a bit. And this is an example of one of them where it does a little bit on the UI, has some business logic, and it also has some data access to where it needs to create its own table for whatever reason and be able to access that data. So, exactly. I mean, it's just the pattern on how you install a plugin. So yes, you don't want to install a plugin from someone you don't know or someone that's not verified. I believe you can't just be in the marketplace. It's not like, you're somewhat vetted. And they're good people there to where they will check out a plugin before they just put it out there in the marketplace. But yes, you could be very cruel and do some mean things in there. So yeah, it's pretty cool. When it comes to you could toggle by price, so anything that's free, whatnot, you can check out in the marketplace. And typically, what's in the marketplace that's free might even point you to a GitHub repository. All right. It's a little dated now, but there is a course out there on nopCommerce on creating plugins. Again, walking through the architecture, I think, really helps out on the plugins, because then you get a good feel for how the plugins actually work, because they follow the same architecture. So themes are more about the front end, and then plugins are more about the business logic and data access. All right, let's wrap this up. So in summary, my original path in open source was I was working with Pluralsight, and I was looking for an enterprise piece of software like nopCommerce that I was going to create content around. I say was because that whole relationship kind of fell through. Meaning that I was going to work with nopCommerce and refactor different technologies within nopCommerce to where the first course I remember was going to be ASP.NET compared to ASP.NET Core. What does that look like at an enterprise level? And the courses, this might explain a little bit better, to where the courses were involved with what if we like took out jQuery and raised a view engine and put in AngularJS? What would that look like at an enterprise level? A lot of times you see these hello world examples of these different technologies, but you don't really see what it looks like for a full solution. So AngularJS, what about React? What would that look like under the covers if we took that out and put that in place? Angular 2 Plus, which I think is up to like 7 or 8 now, 8? 8, okay. With TypeScript, what would that look like in this solution on the front end? Vue, of course, that's big. And I was talking about at the beginning of this, Blazor, what does that look like in this full solution? On the, these other libraries where you got AutoFact at the business layer, what if you took that out, put in ninject, or used the built-in library? What would that look like in a full-baked solution? When it comes to data access, where we got Entity Framework, what if we put in Hibernate instead, which is a popular library, or Dapper? That's a very popular micro ORM in the .NET space. And then, of course, when it comes to the actual database itself, what if you change out SQL Server and put in Oracle? I'm not a big fan of Oracle, but nonetheless, what would that look like? Or even Postgres. Now, they're supposed to fairly soon support, through the Entity Framework provider, Postgres and MySQL. So I don't know if they're going to make that happen this release, but very soon. That's a big thing on what they're trying to accomplish, I know. All right, so as I was going down the path of pulling all this together for Pluralsight, kind of trying to pull these courses together, I reached out to the founder, Andre. Told him what I was doing. Hey, I'm working at Pluralsight. I'm working with your solution to kind of pull all this together. And I find myself kind of getting derailed a little bit because when you reach out to an organizer of an open source solution that's pretty passionate about what they're doing, you kind of get pulled in. You kind of get sucked into their community, to where I found myself speaking at this conference, basically giving an older version of this talk. And then I even find myself a couple of years later even kind of giving this talk all over the doggone place at their annual conferences, at .NET meetups. And just about a month ago, I was up in Seattle and I did a recording on Channel 9 for them. So it's pretty wild. The more that you get involved in open source, it kind of takes you down the path you may not expect, because the community can be that engaging to where you just want to help out. And getting the word out there about nopCommerce was a fun thing to do. So my path has kind of changed quite a bit, to where I even acquired a couple of nopCommerce projects. So being an independent software developer, I'm now a nopCommerce developer as well, I guess. I am now working on a project right now where I'm swapping out Blazor within the solution itself. That'll be a talk for next year. And I found that this solution itself, when it comes to coaching or just showing teams, I've mentioned this a few times through the talk, that it's a really good reference architecture to look at with somebody else, to kind of prove your point of what dependency injection should look like, what a software should look like if you want to do unit test. It's a great reference architecture to just talk about in an interview. And whether it's nopCommerce or something else, I really hope you find something, because finding an open source project should be a priority of yours. Apply it and then promote it, because then you'll be surprised where it takes you. All right, so I have a recorded version of this out there on YouTube. John will take you to that recording. It's like the very first time I gave the presentation. It's like a read-through recording. nopdocs will take you to the documentation of nopCommerce itself. noptube will take you to nopCommerce's YouTube channel, because it's kind of hard to find. And that's it. Any questions? So I know a lot of you are not .NET developers, so that's why I kind of try to really push through that part of it. But nonetheless, when it comes to looking at .NET architecture, and if you're wanting to look at .NET more, this is an achievable platform. In other words, this is where all the other enterprise solutions either are or want to be. So if you're looking at the .NET space in general, this is an architecture that's worth checking out just for the purpose of, okay, this is what it is to be a .NET developer. And I noticed for Java, broadleaf, that broadleaf commerce is one for the Java space as well. Still trying to find some good ones in the JavaScript space, to be honest with you. They're all too busy doing their own thing, I think. But yes, it would be nice to find some really good enterprise examples on the Angular community, and as well as React and so on.
So fluent validation, is that .NET exclusively or is that available?
Fluent validation, that pattern is not .NET exclusively. Matter of fact, .NET, they get, like nhibernate was Hibernate in Java. There's so many things that have been ported over to .NET that came from originally the Java community. But then when it comes to other aspects, you find there is some other parallel in other stacks. So that fluent approach, when it comes to the Lambda expression that you can do nowadays, so on the JavaScript side with ES6 or whatever it's changed to, ES 2015, that standard of doing a Lambda, it's part of the language now. So you're finding more of that fluent syntax that can get very confusing because it's kind of executed as one line in a way, so it's hard to debug sometimes. Yeah, that's a pattern across all the stacks I'm finding becoming popular. Provides it more of a functional kind of feel. I think that's why more and more stacks are doing things that way. Or not stacks, developers. I think that's why they're doing more of it that way. They're just making it more, as these different languages evolve, like C# and Java and JavaScript, they're trying to do things in a more, I guess you call it terse kind of fashion. Yeah.
Can you explain further on the API side?
Yep.
You said something about a plugin API.
Yep.
Does it leverage ASP.NET Web API REST on how to put in the plugin and then have the ASP.NET Web API sit on it?
So that plugin was created for an ASP.NET MVC that wasn't .NET Core. So in .NET Core now, doing a web API is kind of built in. You really don't do a separate solution now. It's not a separate library. So yes, in the past, prior to .NET Core, you had these extra libraries that you would kind of bring into your solution. And what I was demonstrating earlier is that as a nopCommerce developer, if you wanted to have an API in nopCommerce to where you wanted to expose get products or get customers, well, not get customers, I don't want to expose that, but get some unsecured kind of information out of your site, you could do that through a plugin, which I thought was pretty impressive. Now, so yeah, you can still do that through a plugin in nopCommerce and expose other methods, but you don't have to worry about like an extra install or anything like that of Web API. Yeah, the API aspect is now part of .NET Core. Yeah, it's not as difficult. Yeah. And there's other ones I noticed that, where they sell other APIs on top of Nop as a plugin, even as standalone. So there's even people have written like mobile solutions with Xamarin that you can purchase. No one's really done an open source one. There's many aspects to whether it's nopCommerce or something else to where you can do something open source to kind of show what you know. Like you could be the one that creates the open source version of the mobile app for nopCommerce or for another solution that's out there.
And is it easy to, from your own personal research, because most applications now, enterprise applications are now being built decoupling the front end from the back end, right? So like you said, Angular, React, Blazor.
Yep.
From your own perspective, what framework or what enterprise front end framework do you think can be used to communicate with controller, having it isolated? Because what I'm saying is MVC, which is kind of like tightly coupling the view with the controller.
It does.
Yeah. So
In the .NET world, it heavily does. To where so in the .NET world, I tend to think of the MVC, model view controller, all three of those as a UI thing. to where in other stacks, the controller is probably more regarded as being in the service layer. When I think of a .NET architecture, I really think of the controller still feeling more like it's on the UI layer than it is in the service layer, to where you then have different service classes that are dealing with your business logic. In NOP, I have noticed that the controllers is probably where, for amount of logic you might find in a controller versus in a service class, there might be a little bit too much business logic in a controller, because it's not a perfect application. But that distinction, even the developers are like, maybe we should just put this if criteria here in the controller. But MVC, even though it's really described to be a separate architecture, the MVC itself, model view controller, in a .NET world still feels like that's more UI. And how you even create like service classes and things like that, it's kind of different than how you would do that with the UI stuff in the controller. So yeah, it's a little different in this stack, I think. It's a little more munged together. That's why I tend to create my controllers more of a pass-through, where I try not to have any kind of logic inside of them. And they're just the purpose of the controller from a .NET developer's perspective is to wire up the model to the view and return that view. If you're doing a lot more logic inside of there, you're probably putting too much into the controller itself. And also when it comes to testing, you don't have to put so much emphasis on unit test around your controllers if you put more of the logic in a library that you're already injecting into, like at the service library, like they have in NOP. And even though that's like my perception of a .NET stack, I have seen a little bit more of that crossover in other stacks too. So I think .NET kind of muddies the water a little bit more than other stacks, but other stacks are prone to making that, to where the controller is probably still what's really bringing your UI together. So even though you're having, let's say your controller, because I see this a lot, your controller is hitting the database directly in other architectures. And that's not good at all. You want something in between your controller, at least, and then the data access itself, so you can really manage that better. But yeah, it's one of those developer struggles I see. How much do you put in that controller versus separating it? All right, any other questions? All right, thanks everyone.